it's been quite an interesting period in public affairs in Australia. The contemporary Australian economic and social model was pretty much set by the time the decade began. And 2001, we'd finally bedded down the GST, which seemed to be the last of the big reforms of the 70s and 80s that people talked about and then did. So, interesting part about the GST, I had another look at it for the quarterly essay, and I'm also working on a book at the moment which is not yet ready. But we're roughly at the 10th anniversary point when John Howard gave up being an economic reformer. Now, that was partly by the circumstance he was under. He didn't have a very good second half of his second term because the GST did give him a lot of problem at that sort of micro retail politics level. And of course, when I say 10 years ago is when this thing started, it's when the motor lobby got to talk a government out of giving up a growth tax. So when the fuel indexation was frozen and they gave back that 1.5 cent litre difference with the GST implementation on petrol, what they ended up doing was declaring to a prominent vested interest group that a government will blink if you can show them losers. Now, the reason why I think the reform era has been dead for that 10 years is that every vested interest saw that and remembered it, because John Howard had he'd just seen off the Indonesians in East Timor barely a year ago. So it's not that he was an insubstantial figure by that point. He was actually quite a strong Prime Minister, viewed quite well by the electorate. So he blinks on GST. And what's happened in the intervening 10 years? Every time somebody puts up a big idea, the first thing we do, and unfortunately journalists make this mistake as much as anyone, is look for the person who's saying no. And the person who's saying no has usually got an interest in nothing happening, of course, but no isn't the whole story. Now, the difficulty I think I see across both sides of politics, it's all right now that the coalition are in a bit of a polling role and no seems to be working for them in the in Newspoll and the like. The difficulty both sides have is coming up with an idea that can get past that initial hurdle. Now, one of the problems that relates to the past 10 years that I've seen is the acceleration of the news cycle has also shortened the attention span of politicians. Now, politicians are coming in for a fair bit of criticism in Lindsay Tanner's latest book, himself included. But the problem is the era that we're all operating in, and this is almost a digital age issue, makes it very difficult to get a conversation not only started, but once it starts, to stop it from going completely off the rails and then people running away from the subject matter. So I'll just sort of give you that as a bit of an overview. This is just so you can get a feel for how someone in the working media has seen the period that we're operating in. Now I'm going to give each their turn, and then we're going to throw to questions. We'll get about 10 minutes each in presentation. Now there won't be any speeches in the questions because most of the talking has to come from this end, but we're definitely keen for an exchange. Now, David Hetherington is going to go first. Of course, he's the founding executive director of Capita, and he's got extensive experience in public policy in the UK and in Australia. Now I'll throw to David first, and we'll take it 10 minutes at a time from our speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, George, and good afternoon, everybody. Thanks to Nick and Matthew and their colleagues at Chifley for inviting me to contribute here today. Look, there are obviously 101 things you can cover under the banner of fairness, work in the economy. You could talk about IR, you could talk about green jobs, you could talk about the privatisation of profits and the socialisation of losses. But I just want to take my 10 minutes to focus on one quite simple idea, and that is what I see as the false trade-off between prosperity and fairness. I want to tell you why I think it's a false trade-off. I want to tell you how it distorts our view of government and how it distorts our view of our own community, and I want to tell you how I think we can overcome it. With due respect to all the economists in the room, I think that, like with many of the other world's problems, economists are partly to blame for this perception. Economists originally conceived of a trade-off between efficiency and equity, with equity as efficiency's poor cousin. And the idea has kind of taken root amongst society at large. It's now widely accepted that the price of becoming more prosperous is inequality. You can put that another way and say that any measure that advances fairness is seen to harm our standard of living, not just for those wealthy people who might pay for that measure, but for society as a whole. But what does the evidence tell us about prosperity and fairness? Well, it says that far from being a trade-off, the two can exist hand in hand. In aggregate, richer countries are more equal than poorer ones. This doesn't necessarily mean that wealth causes equality or vice versa, but it definitely doesn't mean that wealth precludes greater equality or vice versa. And as we know, the United States is often held up as the great example that proves the prosperity versus fairness trade-off. But consider this, in the US over the last 40 years, inequality has grown considerably, while average real wages have actually declined. So, you know, there's no trade-off there. That's shrinking prosperity accompanied by falling fairness. Now, despite the fact that the trade-off is false, it's come to dominate our public debate. In some sections of corporate Australia, and I think George is alluding to this in part in his introduction, it's assumed that anything that threatens a company's quarterly earnings is by extension a cancer on our body politic. Just in the last year alone, I can count mining super profits tax, banking competition, pokies reform, MySuper, cigarette advertising, and as we all know, a carbon tax as examples of these issues where you get very, very loud screams from corporate Australia. An American CEO was famously misquoted in the 1950s as saying, "What's good for General Motors is good for the country." In the last couple of weeks, we might have rephrased this to say, if it's bad for BlueScope, it's bad for Australia. Or maybe, if it hurts the short-term earnings of BlueScope, it's bad for Australia. But it's not just companies that cling to the trade-off. Individual attitudes in our community also exhibit a belief that fairness comes at a cost. My think tank, Per Capita, runs an annual survey of perceptions on taxation, which turns up some curious facts. A huge majority of people want more public spending on better public services. Yet most of them believe at the same time that they pay too much tax. As a community as a whole, we believe that the rich don't pay enough tax. The rich themselves agree with this, but they don't perceive themselves as rich, so they think they're overtaxed. And what this tells me is that since we don't think it's possible to have fairness with prosperity, we're happy to demand fairness as long as someone else is around to pay for it. Now, what's driven this belief amongst the community? Was it always this way? I don't think it was. I had a conversation with our absent panellist, Paul Howes, last year, in which he made quite an astute observation that over the course of the Howard years, John Howard very successfully dragged the political centre of gravity in Australia to the right. Material accumulation has become more socially acceptable. It's called keeping up with the Joneses. Our public discourse became more fractious, more angry. And guess what? Anger needs a target. So the right has singled out all those undeserving free riders, the asylum seekers, the dole bludgers, who use the cloak of fairness to leech away at our national prosperity. And as belief in this false trade-off has become the orthodoxy, we start to behave as though it's true. Ross Gittins had an interesting piece in the Herald this week where he made the point that people behave more selfishly when their environment expects or demands this kind of behaviour. So he related the results of some experiments in game theory where the name of the game actually influenced the way people behaved. They behave more selfishly when a game is called business transaction study than when it's called social exchange study. They behave more selfishly when it's called the Wall Street game rather than the community game. Now, I reckon political parties are exactly the same. They respond to the false trade-off too. So what do the Conservatives do? They play up the wedge for all that it's worth. You know the tune. Any measure that advances fairness is a sop to all us sponges on the left who are trying to bleed hard-working Australians dry. What's more surprising and disappointing, I think, is the way progressive parties have responded to this. I think the Greens buy this false trade-off completely. All measures to advance fairness must reduce prosperity, or they're not fair dinkum. Business is always trying to rip off downtrodden Aussies. And I think those views are just plain wrong. There are heaps of good businesses out there innovating every day to provide the goods and services that we all value. It's true that trade-exposed, emissions-intensive industries will need structural adjustment packages under a carbon price. We've got to cut emissions, but we also need to look after those displaced workers who lose their jobs through no fault of their own. That's different, though, from compensating shareholders who knew or should have known the risk they were taking when they bought that equity. Now, I worry that Labor's response to the false trade-off has been even worse, if anything, than the Greens. I think Labor's felt under pressure to follow the political centre of gravity to the right. It's been at pains to be seen to promote prosperity and to emphasise its willingness to sacrifice fairness where it impedes prosperity. We dropped the CPRS after some tough focus group feedback in Queensland. We felt the need to talk tough on welfare recipients and asylum seekers. And this is just not what Labor is about. In the last month, I've had two very different people tell me why they're walking away from the party. One is an infirm pensioner, a member for 40 years. The other is a partner in a professional services firm, a rusted-on supporter, was in the room in Bankstown when Keating embraced the True Believers. And they both say that they can't stomach the rejection of fairness, the implicit demonisation of the vulnerable, even if that's the price of staying in power. Yet this response from Labor this behaviour from Labor is a direct response to a false trade-off. We can't beat the Conservatives at their own game. Instead, we need to be dragging the political centre of gravity back from the right and arguing that it's possible to deliver prosperity with fairness. What is it we really want from progressive governments? I reckon it boils down to a couple of simple things. We want social justice, which provides fairness, and we want policy creativity, which delivers prosperity. We don't want fairness without prosperity, that's East Germany, and we don't want prosperity without fairness, that's Wall Street. Now, throughout Australian history, progressive governments have a proud track record of delivering the two in tandem. You all know the examples: universal suffrage, living wage, 8 hour day, HECS, Medicare, floating the dollar, super. It's as long as your arm, that list. But progressive political leaders need to continue that tradition today, decoupling the false link between prosperity and fairness and instead advancing solutions which reinforce a virtuous circle between the two. I think Julia Gillard's dogged pursuit of a carbon price in the face of stiff resistance is a welcome move in this direction, although it remains to be seen whether she'll overcome that resistance. The virtuous circle also involves a recognition that markets provide powerful forces that can be harnessed to promote prosperity and fairness, but that they are a means rather than an end. Market design has been used successfully in areas as diverse as employment services and water management, and I think a well-designed carbon market is a logical next step. The virtuous circle requires a recognition that, contrary to the claims of classical economics, much of our behaviour is irrational, and it's predictably so. We're addictive. We smoke, drink, eat too much. We make promises to ourselves and then fail to keep them. Policy initiatives should be developed with these insights in mind, rather than the assumption that individuals are utility maximising, perfectly rational calculators. Initiatives which put pre-commitment limits on gambling losses, which provide opt-out default super accounts. These recognise explicitly the limits of human rationality, and they demand small short-term costs, often by producers, in the pursuit of long-term economic and social gain. There are a ton of policy initiatives that build on these insights. We can capture the dividends of the mining boom by channeling super profits into a sovereign wealth fund. The IMF said yesterday that we should be doing this. We can increase housing supply by restricting negative gearing to new build houses only. We can finance infrastructure by tapping the nation's superannuation pool. We can stimulate R&D, not only with public spending, but by promoting competition so that the big oligopolists in this country are forced to compete on innovation as well as price. Now, all of these things will draw resistance from the privileged incumbents who are threatened by this change. Yet all of them advance fairness as well as long-term prosperity. As we've seen in the carbon tax, this battle will be fierce, but I think Labor needs to remember that it's at its best when it hits that sweet spot, which is the virtuous circle of prosperity and fairness. Thank you.